We are about to dive into the mysterious waters of the Nile River, exploring the incredible fish, creatures, and plants that shaped ancient Egyptian civilization for thousands of years. This journey will reveal how the ancient Egyptians saw these aquatic beings not just as food or dangers to avoid, but as living symbols of their deepest beliefs about life, death, and rebirth. Together, we will discover why a simple fish could become a god, and how the rhythm of the river's waters created one of the greatest civilizations humanity has ever known. Before we go back in time together, if you're enjoying settling in for the night with a bit of Egyptian history, consider hitting subscribe. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Have you ever wondered why ancient Egypt became one of the most powerful civilizations in human history when it was surrounded by endless desert? The answer flows through the heart of their land, a ribbon of blue cutting through golden sands. The Nile River was not just water to the ancient Egyptians. It was life itself. It was their highway, their farm, their temple, and their connection to the divine. Without the Nile, there would be no pyramids, no pharaohs, no golden masks or towering statues. There would be nothing but sand stretching to the horizon. Imagine standing on the banks of the Nile over 3,000 years ago. The sun rises over the eastern desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The river before you stretches wide and calm, its surface reflecting the heavens above. Birds wade in the shallows, spearing fish with their sharp beaks. Fishermen push their papyrus boats into the current, nets draped over their shoulders. The air smells of wet earth and lotus flowers. This is the gift of the Nile, the miracle that allowed millions of people to thrive in one of the harshest environments on earth. The Nile River flows north for over 4,000 miles, making it one of the longest rivers in the world. It begins far to the south in the highlands of East Africa, where heavy rains fall every summer. These rains transform small streams into raging torrents that rush down mountainsides, gathering force and volume. Eventually, these waters join together to form the mighty Nile, which then flows through desert lands, where rain almost never falls. This journey from the rainy highlands to the arid desert created the annual miracle that ancient Egyptians depended on for their very survival. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would begin to rise. Starting in late June or early July, the water level would slowly climb higher and higher. By August and September, the river would overflow its banks, spreading across the flat lands on either side. This was not a disaster. This was a blessing. The ancient Egyptians called this time Akhet, the season of inundation. For 3 months, the river would cover the fields, turning the landscape into a vast, shallow lake dotted with villages on higher ground. When the waters finally receded in October, they left behind a gift more precious than gold. A thick layer of rich black silt covered the fields, soil so fertile that seeds planted in it would grow abundantly with little effort. This cycle of flooding and planting shaped every aspect of ancient Egyptian life. Their calendar divided the year into 3 seasons based on the Nile. First came Akhet, the flooding season. Then came Perch, the growing season when crops sprouted and matured in the fertile silt. Finally came Shemu, the harvest season when farmers gathered their crops before the cycle began again. The Egyptians became experts at reading the river, predicting its moods, and working with its rhythms. They built devices called Nilometers, stone structures with markings that measured the height of the flood. If the flood was too low, crops would fail and famine would follow. If it rose too high, villages could be destroyed. The perfect flood meant prosperity for everyone. But the Nile gave the Egyptians far more than just fertile soil. The river itself teemed with life. Its waters held fish by the hundreds of species, providing protein for rich and poor alike. Its banks were thick with papyrus reeds, which the Egyptians used to make everything from boats to sandals to the world's first paper. The marshes and shallows attracted countless birds, from tiny plovers to massive herons, and these birds became part of the Egyptian diet and mythology. Crocodiles sunned themselves on muddy banks, dangerous predators that inspired both fear and worship. Hippopotamuses wallowed in deeper pools, their massive bodies disappearing beneath the surface before exploding upward in territorial displays. The ancient Egyptians understood that they lived at the mercy of the Nile's generosity. They saw the river not as a random force of nature, but as a divine gift that needed to be honoured and respected. They created gods and goddesses connected to the river and its life. Hapi was the god of the annual flooding, depicted as a man with a large belly and breasts, symbolising the nourishment and fertility the flood brought. Sobek was the crocodile god, fierce and protective. Osiris himself, the god of death and rebirth, was associated with the Nile's life-giving waters and the cycles of flooding and renewal. The connection between the Nile and Egyptian religion went even deeper. The ancient Egyptians believed that before creation there existed only Nun, the primordial waters of chaos. From these waters emerged the first god, Atum, who stood upon a mound of earth that rose from the flood. This creation story mirrors perfectly what the Egyptians witnessed every year. As the Nile's floods receded, mounds of earth would emerge from the water, and life would spring forth from them. The annual flood was not just agriculture, it was the reenactment of creation itself, proof that the gods were still active and still blessing Egypt with life. In this world shaped by water, the creatures that lived in the Nile became far more than just animals. They became symbols loaded with meaning, bridges between the human world and the divine. A fish was not simply food swimming by. It might be a form taken by a god, a messenger from the realm of the dead, or a symbol of rebirth and eternal life. To understand ancient Egypt, we must understand these creatures. We must learn to see them as the Egyptians did, as participants in a cosmic drama that played out every day on the banks of their sacred river. The fishermen who pushed their small boats into the Nile current each morning were not just hunting for dinner. They were entering a realm where the boundary between the mundane and the magical grew thin. The water beneath their papyrus boats held mysteries. Some fish could be caught and eaten freely. Others were sacred and forbidden in certain regions. To catch and eat a forbidden fish might bring the anger of the gods upon an entire village. The Nile's waters demanded respect, knowledge, and devotion. Children growing up along the Nile learned from their earliest days which creatures were safe and which were dangerous, which were holy and which were common. They learned that the calm surface of the river could hide death in the form of a lurking crocodile. They learned that certain times of year brought certain fish to the shallows, and that the gods had preferences and favourites among the creatures of the river. They learned that water was not just water. It was possibility, it was danger, it was blessing, and it was home to beings both physical and spiritual. For the wealthy Egyptians, those who could afford to have artists decorate their tomb walls with scenes of daily life, the Nile's abundance was a promise of eternal comfort. Tomb paintings show nobles spearing fish from papyrus boats, their families dressed in fine linens, servants ready with baskets to collect the catch. These images were not just memories of good times. They were magical insurance, intended to ensure that the deceased would continue to enjoy the Nile's bounty in the afterlife. The fish swimming in those painted waters would become real again, ready to be caught and eaten forever. The Nile shaped not only how the Egyptians lived, but how they thought about life itself. The river's daily flow from south to north became associated with the journey of the sun god Ra across the sky. Ra travelled in a boat, the solar barque, which sailed through the heavenly waters just as earthly boats sailed the Nile. At night, the Egyptians believed, Ra's boat entered the underworld and travelled through its dark waters, battling the chaos serpent Apophis before emerging victorious at dawn. The Nile and the cosmos were mirrors of each other, connected by an invisible web of meaning and symbol. This is the world we are about to explore more deeply. A world where a catfish could be a king's guardian, where a lotus flower held the secret of creation, where a hippopotamus goddess protected mothers in childbirth, and where the rhythm of the river's flood was the heartbeat of an entire civilization. The ancient Egyptians did not separate the natural from the supernatural. For them, a fish swimming past was simultaneously a real creature of scales and fins, and a potential manifestation of divine power. The Nile's waters held both dinner and divinity, practical necessity and profound mystery. As we continue this journey together, we will meet the specific creatures that populated the Nile's waters and banks. We will learn their names, both ancient Egyptian and modern. We will discover the myths told about them, the gods they represented, and the roles they played in daily life. We will understand why some fish were mummified and buried with as much care as a pharaoh, while others were caught by the thousands and eaten without ceremony. We will see how the Nile's aquatic life created a rich, symbolic language that the Egyptians used to express their deepest hopes, fears, and beliefs. The Nile is still flowing today, still sustaining life in Egypt, but the relationship has changed. Modern Egyptians have built dams that control the flood, transforming the ancient seasonal cycle into something predictable and manageable. The annual inundation no longer comes. The rich black silt no longer covers the fields naturally. Many of the creatures that once filled the river have declined or disappeared entirely. The sacred ibis, once so common that millions were mummified as offerings, is now extinct in Egypt. The papyrus marshes that once stretched for miles have largely vanished. The ancient gods no longer receive offerings at their temples, but the memory remains, preserved in the art and writing left behind by that remarkable civilization. We can still read the hymns praising the Nile's generosity. We can still see the tomb paintings showing fish and birds and boats. We can still hold in our hands the small amulets shaped like tilapia fish that mothers wore to ensure safe childbirth. We can still decipher the hieroglyphs that used pictures of water birds and fish to represent sounds and ideas. The ancient Egyptians left us a detailed record of their watery world, and through it, we can glimpse how they understood the relationship between human beings and the natural world that sustained them. So let us push our imaginary papyrus boat into the current. Let us float down the Nile as it was thousands of years ago, when gods walked its banks and every ripple on its surface might signal something holy. Let us meet the tilapia that symbolized rebirth, the catfish that protected pharaohs, the Nile perch sacred to warrior goddesses, and the mysterious elephant fish whose role in the Osiris myth made it both revered and forbidden. Let us understand why the lotus flower closing at night and opening at dawn seemed like a miracle to people watching closely. Let us stand at a respectful distance from the crocodile sunning itself on a mud bank, knowing that to ancient eyes this was not just a reptile but the god Sobek himself, capable of protecting or destroying with equal ease. The Nile's aquatic life was the foundation of ancient Egyptian civilization, not just as a food source, but as a way of understanding the universe and humanity's place in it. These creatures offered ancient Egyptians a window into the nature of existence itself. In their behaviors, the Egyptians saw patterns that resonated with their own experiences of birth, growth, death, and hopefully rebirth. The fish that hid its young in its mouth and then released them seemed to die and resurrect its offspring. The lotus that sank beneath the water at sunset and rose again at dawn enacted death and resurrection daily. The crocodile that could live both on land and in water bridged two worlds, just as the soul had to bridge the world of the living and the world of the dead. These were not primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated attempts to find meaning and pattern in the natural world, to create a framework for understanding the biggest questions humans face. Why do we die? Is there life after death? How did the world begin? What forces control our fate? The ancient Egyptians looked to the Nile and its inhabitants for answers, and what they discovered there shaped one of the longest-lasting and most influential civilizations in human history. Their answers, encoded in symbols drawn from aquatic life, still speak to us today across the gulf of millennia, reminding us that water is life, that nature provides both sustenance and meaning, and that paying attention to the world around us can reveal truths about the world within us. Chapter 2: The Sacred Tilapia and the Mystery of Rebirth. Why would a fish, just an ordinary fish you might catch and cook for dinner, become one of the most important religious symbols in ancient Egypt? What did the ancient Egyptians see when they looked at this creature that we missed for thousands of years? The answer lies in a remarkable behavior that occurs in the shallow waters of the Nile, a behavior so striking that it seemed to the Egyptians like proof of resurrection itself. The Nile tilapia is not a large or particularly impressive fish to modern eyes. It grows to about a foot long, has a somewhat flat body, and comes in shades of grey, silver, and olive green. It prefers warm, shallow waters and often gathers in large groups near the banks where vegetation grows thick. Today, tilapia is one of the most commonly farmed fish in the world, valued for its mild taste and rapid growth. Millions of people eat tilapia every week without giving it a second thought. But to ancient Egyptians, this humble fish was a living miracle, a symbol of fertility and rebirth so powerful that it earned its own hieroglyph in their writing system. The tilapia's symbolic importance came from a unique aspect of its biology. The tilapia is what scientists call a mouth brooder. After the female lays her eggs, the male fertilizes them, and then one of the parents, usually the male, gathers the eggs into its mouth. The fish then carries these eggs in its mouth for about 2 weeks, protecting them from predators. During this time, the parent fish does not eat, devoting all its energy to keeping the next generation safe. When the eggs finally hatch, tiny fish fry emerge from the parent's mouth, appearing to an observer as if the adult fish is giving birth through its mouth, bringing fully formed young fish into the world from what seems like nothing. To the ancient Egyptians, watching this process was like witnessing spontaneous generation, the creation of life from the void. They did not understand genetics or embryonic development. What they saw was a fish that appeared to swallow something, or perhaps swallow nothing at all, and then later, weeks later, that same fish would open its mouth and tiny living fish would pour out. It looked like magic. It looked like resurrection. It looked like the fish had died and been reborn, or like the fish had the power to create life from death. This behavior connected the tilapia to the most fundamental Egyptian myths about creation. In the beginning, according to the Heliopolitan creation myth, there was only none, the primordial waters. From these waters, the god Atum created himself, pulling himself into existence by an act of pure will. Then Atum created the first pair of gods, Shu the air god and Tefnut the moisture goddess, by spitting them out of his mouth. Other versions say he sneezed them out, or created them through other bodily functions, but the idea remained the same. The creator god brought forth life from within himself, exhaling or expelling the first beings into existence. When Egyptians watched a tilapia open its mouth and release dozens of baby fish, they saw an echo of this cosmic act. The fish was reenacting creation, bringing forth life from within itself just as Atum had done at the beginning of time. The fish became a living symbol of the creative power that brought the universe into being. No wonder they considered it sacred. No wonder they wore amulets shaped like tilapia, believing these charms could channel the fish's regenerative power. The connection went even deeper. The tilapia was especially associated with the goddess Hathor, one of the most important and complex deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Hathor was a goddess of many things: love, beauty, music, dance, fertility, and motherhood. She was often depicted as a cow or as a woman with cow ears, and she was believed to help women through the dangerous process of childbirth. The tilapia, with its apparent ability to give birth through its mouth, to protect its young within its own body, seemed like a perfect symbol for Hathor's protective, nurturing power. Women in ancient Egypt, especially pregnant women or those hoping to become pregnant, would wear small amulets shaped like tilapia fish. These charms were made from various materials including gold, silver, bronze, and faience, a glazed ceramic material the Egyptians made in brilliant blue and green colours. The fish amulets were believed to transfer the tilapia's fertility and protective power to the wearer. Just as the tilapia kept its young safe in its mouth, Hathor would keep the unborn child safe in the womb. Just as the tilapia eventually released healthy, living young, the mother would safely deliver a healthy, living child. The tilapia also became associated with the sun god Ra and the daily cycle of death and rebirth that the sun represented. Each evening, Ra's sunboat would sink below the western horizon, entering the dangerous waters of the underworld. During the night, Ra would battle the chaos serpent Apophis, who tried to prevent the sun from rising again. If Apophis succeeded, the world would end. But every morning, Ra emerged victorious from the underworld waters, and the sun rose again in the east. This daily journey from life to death to life again was the ultimate proof that resurrection was possible. The tilapia became connected to this solar journey. Some texts mention fish serving as guides or scouts for Ra's boat, swimming ahead to warn of dangers. The tilapia specifically, with its symbolic association with birth and rebirth, became emblematic of the sun's resurrection. Just as the fish disappeared into darkness, its mouth closed around its precious cargo of eggs, only to open again, releasing new life. So too did the sun disappear into the underworld, only to emerge reborn each dawn. By the New Kingdom period, roughly 1500 years before the Common Era, tilapia imagery had become extremely popular. Scarabs, those beetle-shaped amulets that Egyptians carried and wore in huge numbers, frequently featured tilapia fish as decoration. Young women wore tilapia-shaped earrings and pendants. The fish appeared in tomb paintings, often held in the hands of noble women or swimming among lotus flowers. The association with lotus was natural because both represented rebirth. The lotus closed and sank beneath the water at night, seeming to die, then rose and opened again at dawn, reborn with the sun. In art, the tilapia was sometimes shown with a lotus flower in its mouth, or swimming near lotus plants. This combination symbolized the complete cycle of death and resurrection. It was a visual prayer or spell, an image meant to ensure that the person who owned it, or whose tomb it decorated, would experience the same rebirth. Death was not the end. Like the lotus, like the sun, like the tilapia, the deceased would emerge again into life, transformed but recognizable, continuing their existence in the eternal fields of the blessed dead. The tilapia even appeared in the Egyptian system of writing. The hieroglyph for fish, which often specifically depicted a tilapia, could represent the sound in, or be used as a determinative, a symbol indicating that the word being written related to fish or aquatic life. The very structure of their written language incorporated the image of this sacred fish, proof of how deeply it had embedded itself into Egyptian consciousness. Interestingly, despite being sacred and symbolically important, tilapia was also eaten, at least by common people. Archaeological excavations of ancient Egyptian villages have turned up tilapia bones in garbage heaps and cooking areas. It seems that the religious significance of the fish did not make it completely taboo as food. However, there were regional and class differences in these food taboos. Some areas forbade eating certain fish, and priests and other religious officials often had to follow stricter dietary rules than ordinary people. It is possible that while commoners could eat tilapia, the upper classes or religious specialists avoided it out of reverence. This practical contradiction is very human and very Egyptian. The Egyptians were skilled at holding multiple ideas in tension. A fish could be sacred and also be food. A creature could be a manifestation of divine power and also just an animal going about its life. The Nile had to provide for both the body and the soul, and the creatures in it served both purposes. The key was approaching them with the right attitude and in the right context. A fisherman, catching tilapia to feed his family, was performing an ordinary, necessary act. A person wearing a tilapia amulet and praying to Hathor was engaging with the same creature on an entirely different level, accessing its symbolic power rather than its nutritional value. The tilapia's role in Egyptian culture shows us how closely ancient peoples observed the natural world. They did not have microscopes or scientific journals. They did not understand genetics or developmental biology. But they paid close attention to animal behavior, and they saw patterns that resonated with their own experiences and questions. The tilapia's mouth-brooding behavior genuinely is remarkable. Even today, knowing the scientific explanation, it is striking to watch a fish open its mouth and see dozens of tiny fish stream out. To people without modern biological knowledge, but with deep experience of observing nature, this behavior would have seemed miraculous, worthy of the deepest respect and religious attention. The tilapia reminds us that ancient Egyptian religion was not arbitrary or based solely on abstract philosophy. It was rooted in careful observation of the world around them. The Egyptians lived close to nature, depending on it for survival, and they noticed things. They noticed that the tilapia seemed to give birth through its mouth. They noticed that the lotus followed the sun's path, closing at night and opening at dawn. They noticed that the Nile flooded every year with reliable regularity, and that this flood created conditions for life. They took these observations and wove them into a religious system that gave meaning to human existence and hope for life beyond death. In a way, the ancient Egyptians were doing what scientists do today, observing the natural world, looking for patterns, and trying to understand what those patterns mean. Their framework for understanding was different from ours. They saw gods and magic where we see genes and instinct. But the impulse was the same. Pay attention to the world. Notice what happens. Try to understand it. Use that understanding to make sense of your own life. The sacred tilapia, swimming through the Nile's warm shallows, carrying its eggs in its mouth, releasing its young when the time was right, was more than just a fish to the ancient Egyptians. It was a teacher, a symbol, a promise. It taught them that life could emerge from apparent death. It symbolized the protective power of divine mothers. It promised that the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth would continue, that the sun would rise tomorrow, that the Nile would flood next year, that those who died would live again in the eternal West. All this meaning packed into a humble fish that today we farm by the millions and serve with tartar sauce, barely giving it a thought beyond whether it is fresh and cooked properly. Perhaps we have lost something in gaining our scientific understanding. We know more than the ancient Egyptians did about how tilapia reproduction works. We can explain it in genetic and hormonal terms, but we have largely lost the sense of wonder that they felt, the ability to see in a fish's behavior a window into the deepest mysteries of existence. They saw meaning everywhere because they believed meaning was everywhere. The natural world was not separate from the spiritual world. It was the spiritual world made visible, the gods revealing themselves in every creature, every plant, every ripple on the water's surface. This is what we mean when we talk about the symbolism of the Nile's aquatic life. We are not just discussing what ancient Egyptians believed intellectually. We are trying to understand how they experienced the world, how they felt when they saw a tilapia release its young, or watched a lotus flower open at dawn, or survived another year because the Nile flooded at just the right level. These were not just interesting facts to them, these were sacred truths, proofs that the universe was ordered by benevolent powers who wanted life to continue, who wanted humans to thrive, who provided signs and symbols to guide the faithful through the challenges of existence. The tilapia was one of those signs, one of those gifts. It swam through the Nile in uncountable numbers, accessible to anyone with a net or a hook. But to those who knew how to see, who had been taught the sacred stories, who understood the symbolic language written in fins and scales, and the remarkable behavior of a parent fish protecting its young, the tilapia was nothing less than proof that resurrection was real, that death could be overcome, that new life would always emerge from the depths. And that promise, delivered by a common fish in a common river, helped sustain one of history's greatest civilizations for 3,000 years. Chapter 3: The Nile Catfish and the Power of Kings. Have you ever noticed how the most powerful symbols often come from unexpected places? You might think ancient Egyptian kings would choose lions or falcons or mighty bulls as their primary symbols of power, and they did use all of these. But did you know that for the very earliest pharaohs, the catfish held a position of supreme importance, appearing on royal objects and representing the king's power? Why would a bottom-feeding fish that spends its time in murky water become a symbol of royalty? The Nile catfish is a remarkable creature. Several species of catfish lived in ancient Egypt, but the most symbolically important was probably the Bagrid catfish, which could grow quite large, sometimes reaching lengths of over 3 feet. These fish have distinctive features: long whisker like barbels around their mouths, which help them find food in dark or murky water, smooth skin without scales, and a flattened head with a wide mouth. They are predators despite their gentle appearance, hunting smaller fish and scavenging along the river bottom. What made the catfish special to the earliest Egyptian kings? The answer seems to be connected to the catfish's resilience and power. Catfish are survivors. They can live in water with low oxygen levels that would kill other fish. They can survive out of water for extended periods by breathing air. They are aggressive defenders of their territory and their young. When the Nile's levels dropped during the dry season, concentrating fish in shrinking pools, catfish would be among the last species to survive, hanging on in conditions that killed weaker fish. This toughness and survival ability made the catfish an appropriate symbol for kingship during Egypt's formative period. The earliest pharaohs faced enormous challenges. They were unifying small kingdoms and tribal territories into a single nation, imposing order on chaos, defending against enemies, and establishing the basic structures of government and religion that would last for millennia. They needed to project strength, resilience, and the ability to thrive in difficult conditions. The catfish, with its survival instincts and predatory power, embodied these qualities perfectly. One of the most famous early Egyptian objects featuring catfish is the Narmer palette, a ceremonial stone carving from around 3,100 years before the Common Era. King Narmer is traditionally credited with unifying Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom, becoming the first pharaoh of the first dynasty. The palette, which was probably used for grinding cosmetics in ritual contexts, shows Narmer in his role as victorious warrior king, defeating enemies and establishing his rule. At the top of the palette, fish symbols, likely catfish, appear alongside other hieroglyphs spelling out the king's name and titles. Even more striking is the Narmer mace head, another ceremonial object from the same king's reign. This limestone carving shows the king presiding over a ceremony, surrounded by symbols of his power. Among these symbols are large catfish, positioned prominently to indicate their importance. The repeated appearance of catfish in Narmer's royal imagery was not accidental. For this founding pharaoh, the catfish represented something essential about kingship itself. But the catfish had meaning beyond toughness. In Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, the catfish represented the sound na. This made it useful, for writing certain names and words. King Nama's name may itself have been chosen partly because it could be written using the catfish symbol, linking the king's identity to this powerful creature. The hieroglyph showed a catfish and a chisel, the chisel representing the sound mer, together spelling Nama. Every time someone wrote the king's name, they drew a catfish, reinforcing the connection between royal power and this aquatic predator. The symbolic association between catfish and royalty seems to have been particularly strong in Upper Egypt, the southern region of the country. Upper Egypt was traditionally the more militaristic and aggressive of the two regions that united to form ancient Egypt. Lower Egypt, in the north where the Nile Delta spreads out before meeting the Mediterranean Sea, was wealthier and more cosmopolitan, its power based on trade and agriculture. Upper Egypt's power was more martial, based on military might and tough desert warriors. The catfish, a predator and survivor, fit Upper Egypt's self-image perfectly. Archaeological evidence shows that catfish were also important for practical reasons. Ancient Egyptian village sites contain catfish bones in great quantities. These fish were a significant food source, probably caught in large numbers during the low water season, when they concentrated in shrinking pools and channels. Ancient tomb paintings and reliefs show various fishing methods, and catfish are identifiable in several of these scenes. Fishermen used nets, traps, hooks, and even their bare hands to catch catfish, which could be grabbed directly when spotted in shallow water during low Nile periods. The method of hand-catching catfish, while risky due to the fish's sharp spines, became associated with bravery and skill. A man who could wade into murky water and pull out a large, thrashing catfish using only his hands demonstrated courage, strength, and confidence. These were all royal qualities. Young men of the upper classes might have learned to catch catfish by hand as a kind of coming-of-age challenge, proving they possessed the qualities needed to lead and fight. Catfish also appeared in religious contexts. The god Atum, who created himself from the primordial waters and began the process of creation, was sometimes associated with fish, including catfish. This connection made sense because catfish, which could survive in the most difficult conditions, rising to breathe air when water, oxygen was low, seemed to bridge two worlds, the water and the air, the primordial chaos and the ordered creation. A fish that could breathe air was a liminal creature, existing between categories, much as the gods existed between the human and divine realms. The female catfish's habit of protecting her eggs and young also gave the fish maternal protective connotations. Like the tilapia, certain catfish species are devoted parents, guarding their offspring aggressively against predators. This protective fierceness made the catfish an appropriate symbol for protective deities as well as for kings who defended their people. The catfish could represent both the aggressive power needed to defeat enemies and the protective power needed to keep one's people safe. As Egyptian history progressed and the earliest dynasties gave way to later periods, the catfish became less prominent in royal symbolism. Other animals took center stage: the falcon for the god Horus, who was embodied in the king, the bull for raw power and fertility, the lion for martial might. But the catfish never completely disappeared. It remained part of the hieroglyphic system, continued to appear in art and amulets, and stayed important in local religious contexts, even as national attention shifted to other creatures. One possible reason for the catfish's declining royal prominence might be that it was too common. As Egypt became more centralized and sophisticated, the symbols chosen to represent the pharaoh became more exotic and rare. Anyone could catch a catfish, but lions, bulls, and falcons were more distant from everyday experience, especially for the urban elites of later dynasties, who might never see a wild lion but would certainly see catfish at the market. Royal symbolism gravitates toward the rare and unattainable, not the familiar and everyday. Yet the catfish retained importance in the lives of ordinary Egyptians. Fish in general, and catfish in particular, provided essential protein for people who could not afford large quantities of meat. The Nile's fish were a democratic food source, available to rich and poor alike, though the wealthy ate better cuts and more exotic species. A poor family could catch enough catfish to feed themselves for a week. A wealthy family might enjoy the same fish, but prepared with expensive spices and served alongside other delicacies. Religious dietary restrictions complicated the fish-eating picture. Certain priesthoods forbade eating fish entirely, considering all fish to be impure or sacred. Other priesthoods allowed eating some fish but forbade others. The rules varied by region, by temple, by time period, and by the specific deity being served. This created a complex web of food taboos that scholars are still trying to untangle. What is clear is that fish occupied a strange position in Egyptian culture, simultaneously common food and sacred symbol, everyday resource, and mysterious manifestation of divine power. The catfish embodied this contradiction perhaps more than any other species. It was food and it was symbol. It represented the king and it fed the peasant. It was written in the most sacred inscriptions and sold in the humblest markets. This duality did not bother the Egyptians, who seemed comfortable with ambiguity and multiplicity of meaning. A thing could be two things at once. A fish could be a fish, and also a message from the gods. The trick was knowing which level of meaning mattered in each specific context. For a royal scribe carving the king's name, the catfish was a hieroglyph, a sacred sign connecting the pharaoh to ancient powers. For a fisherman hauling nets into his boat, the catfish was protein and profit, something to sell or eat. For a priestess of a goddess temple, the catfish might be forbidden, its sacredness requiring that it never be consumed. For a child playing by the river's edge, the catfish was a creature to watch for, to avoid stepping on because of its spines, to perhaps catch and bring home proudly if it was small enough to manage. All these meanings coexisted without cancelling each other out. Modern people often want clear categories and single meanings. We are uncomfortable with contradictions, but the ancient Egyptians lived comfortably in a world of layered significance, where the same object or creature could mean different things in different contexts. The catfish teaches us this flexibility of interpretation, this comfort with multiple simultaneous truths. It shows us a way of relating to nature that is both practical and mystical, seeing the same creature as resource and revelation, tool and teacher. When the earliest pharaohs chose the catfish as a royal symbol, they were making a sophisticated choice. They were identifying kingship with survival, with resilience, with the ability to thrive in difficult conditions. They were connecting their power to a creature that every Egyptian knew, creating a symbol that communicated clearly to all levels of society. And they were linking their authority to the Nile itself, claiming that their right to rule came from the same source as the river's life-giving power. The catfish, bottom dweller and survivor, aggressive predator and devoted parent, became a compressed symbol containing multiple meanings: power, resilience, protection, and connection to the Nile's eternal flow. Today, catfish still swim in the Nile, still feed Egyptian families, still survive in conditions that challenge other species. They carry on their existence mostly unmindful of the symbolic weight they once bore. But the images remain, carved in stone palettes and mace heads, painted on tomb walls, written in hieroglyphs on temple columns. The catfish was there at Egypt's beginning, symbolizing the qualities that allowed a nation to emerge from scattered tribes and city-states. It was a gift of the Nile, both practical and profound, common and royal, ordinary and sacred, proving once again that meaning is where you find it, and that the most powerful truths can come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Chapter 4. Sobek, the crocodile god and the terror that protects. What do you do when the most dangerous predator in your river also needs to be worshipped as a god. How do you reconcile genuine terror with religious devotion? The ancient Egyptians faced this challenge daily with the Nile crocodile, a creature that could grow over 15 feet long, weigh over 1,000 pounds, and kill a human with terrifying speed and efficiency. Yet this apex predator was not just feared, it was revered, worshipped, kept in temples, fed offerings, and when it died, mummified with as much care as any human. The crocodile was Sobek, a god of the Nile, and understanding how the Egyptians related to this dangerous animal reveals deep truths about their worldview. The Nile crocodile is one of nature's most successful predators, barely changed over millions of years of evolution because it has no need to change. It is perfectly adapted to its environment. Crocodiles are ambush hunters, lying motionless in water with only their eyes and nostrils above the surface, appearing like floating logs until prey comes close enough. Then they explode into action, moving with shocking speed despite their heavy appearance, clamping massive jaws around the victim and either drowning it or performing the notorious death roll, spinning rapidly in the water to tear off chunks of flesh. Ancient Egyptians witnessed this hunting behavior regularly. Crocodiles would take fish, birds, mammals, and yes, humans. People gathering water at the river's edge, children playing in the shallows, fishermen leaning over the sides of boats, all were at risk. Crocodile attacks were a real danger that required constant vigilance. Mothers must have warned their children endlessly to stay away from certain areas, to watch the water, to never assume safety near the Nile. And yet, despite this genuine threat, or perhaps because of it, the crocodile became one of Egypt's most important deities. Sobek's name in ancient Egyptian was connected to words meaning to be pregnant or to make pregnant, linking the crocodile god to fertility. This association makes sense when you consider the crocodile's connection to the Nile. Crocodiles were particularly visible during the flood season, when rising waters brought them into closer contact with humans. The same floods that brought life-giving silt also brought crocodiles. In the Egyptian mind, both were aspects of the Nile's power, two sides of the same divine force. The river gave life, and it dealt death. Sobek embodied this duality. Sobek was depicted as a man with a crocodile head, often wearing elaborate headdresses that incorporated sun discs, horns, and plumes. He could also be shown as a full crocodile, sometimes with decorative elements marking him as divine rather than merely animal. Temples dedicated to Sobek existed across Egypt, but particularly in areas where crocodiles were common, such as the Fayum region, where marshes and lakes provided ideal crocodile habitat. In these temples, live crocodiles were kept as sacred animals, physical manifestations of the god. These temple crocodiles lived lives of luxury. They were fed choice meats and delicacies. They wore jewelry, gold bracelets on their legs and chains. Priests cared for them, maintaining pools for them to live in, ensuring their comfort. When one of these sacred crocodiles died, it was mummified using expensive materials and techniques, then buried with ceremony and offerings. The death of a temple crocodile was treated as the death of the god himself, requiring mourning and proper funeral rites before a new crocodile could be selected to take its place. The city of Crocodilopolis, also known as Shedet in Egyptian and later Arsinoe by the Greeks, was the primary cult centre of Sobek. Here, the worship of the crocodile god reached extraordinary heights. The main temple complex housed multiple crocodiles, and the fame of these sacred animals spread throughout the ancient world. Greek and Roman tourists visiting Egypt made special trips to Crocodilopolis to see the temple crocodiles and leave offerings. Greek writers described the spectacle with amazement and sometimes with confusion, not quite understanding how Egyptians could worship what the Greeks saw as mere beasts. But to the Egyptians, the crocodile was far from a mere beast. Sobek represented multiple important concepts. He was a god of fertility, but also of military prowess and pharaonic power. The crocodile's aggressive, dominant behavior made it an appropriate symbol for a conquering king. Several pharaohs incorporated Sobek into their royal titulary, adding "Sobek is satisfied" or similar phrases to their names and titles, claiming the crocodile god's power as their own. Sobek was also protective despite his fearsome nature. Egyptian magic and religion often worked on the principle that the best protection against a dangerous force was to align yourself with that force. If crocodiles were the danger, then the crocodile god could protect you from crocodiles. People wore amulets in Sobek's image, believing these would safeguard them against crocodile attacks. Spells invoked Sobek's name to ward off danger from the river. By honoring the crocodile god, Egyptians attempted to transform a threat into a protector. This protective aspect extended beyond physical safety. Sobek became associated with the sun god Ra during certain periods, merging with Ra to become Sobek Ra. In this combined form, Sobek helped defend Ra's solar bark during its nightly journey through the underworld. The crocodile's aggressive nature made it an ideal warrior against the forces of chaos that threatened the sun's rebirth each morning. Sobek Ra would attack the chaos serpent Apophis, using crocodilian ferocity to protect cosmic order. The association between Sobek and Ra also connected the crocodile god to creation myths. In some versions of Egyptian cosmology, Sobek emerged from the primordial waters of Nu and laid eggs that contained the sun and other creative forces. The crocodile, which lays eggs on land but lives primarily in water, bridged the two environments that featured in creation stories. The crocodile moved between land and water with equal ease, making it a suitable agent for bringing order from watery chaos. Sobek had a complex relationship with other gods. In some myths, he was the son of the warrior goddess Neith, which reinforced his associations with combat and protection. In others, he was connected to the goddess Hathor, adding elements of joy and celebration to his worship. Sobek could be fierce or benevolent depending on context, reflecting the Egyptian understanding that all power could manifest in multiple ways. The key was approaching that power correctly. The Greeks, when they encountered Sobek worship, tried to connect it to their own mythology. They sometimes identified Sobek with Helios, their sun god, or with Kronos, the titan associated with time and agriculture. These identifications were never perfect because the gods of different cultures arise from different experiences and answer different needs. But the Greeks recognized in Sobek something primal and powerful, even if they did not fully understand the nuances of Egyptian crocodile worship. Crocodile mummies have been found in huge numbers, suggesting that Sobek worship involved mummifying not just temple crocodiles but also wild ones. Some mummy collections contain thousands of crocodile mummies, ranging from tiny hatchlings to massive adults. These were offerings, sacrifices presented to the god in hopes of gaining his favor or thanks for his protection. The scale of crocodile mummification suggests that Sobek remained popular throughout Egyptian history, from the earliest periods through the Roman era. Archaeological excavations at Sobek temple sites have revealed the infrastructure needed to support crocodile worship: pools and channels for keeping live crocodiles, facilities for mummification, storage rooms for the preserved animals. Sobek worship was not a small operation. It required significant resources and organization, which suggests it provided important spiritual benefits to the people who supported it. What exactly did those benefits involve? For people living along the Nile, with crocodiles a constant danger, Sobek worship provided psychological comfort. By honoring the power that threatened them, they felt less helpless. They were not passive victims of random crocodile attacks. They were participants in a relationship with divine power. If they showed proper respect, gave proper offerings, followed proper procedures, they could influence their fate. This sense of agency in a dangerous world was perhaps Sobek worship's greatest gift. Sobek also represented the uncontrollable aspects of nature that had to be respected rather than conquered. The Egyptians never tried to eliminate crocodiles from the Nile, though they certainly could have organized systematic hunting. Instead, they incorporated crocodiles into their religious system, acknowledging that some dangers cannot and perhaps should not be removed, but must instead be properly understood and honored. This is a sophisticated environmental ethic, recognizing that dangerous predators play important roles in ecosystems and in human spiritual life. The crocodile's ability to live both in water and on land made it a symbol of liminality, of existing between categories. Egyptian religion was full of liminal beings and spaces because the Egyptians understood that the most powerful moments occur at boundaries and transitions. Dawn and dusk, when day becomes night or night becomes day, were times of great spiritual significance. The west bank of the Nile, where the sun set and where tombs were built, was the boundary between life and death. The crocodile, moving easily between water and land, embodied this boundary-crossing power. Sobek could be fierce when fierceness was needed, and calm when calm was needed. This flexibility made him a useful god for many situations. Soldiers going into battle invoked Sobek for martial strength. Farmers hoping for good floods invoked Sobek as a Nile deity. Kings claimed Sobek's power to justify their dominance. Ordinary people wore Sobek amulets for general protection. The crocodile god adapted to different needs while maintaining his essential nature as powerful, dangerous, and demanding of respect. In temple rituals, priests would perform ceremonies for the sacred crocodiles that mirrored ceremonies performed for the gods in general. The crocodiles would be ceremonially fed, bathed, adorned with jewelry, and presented with incense and offerings. The parallel between feeding temple crocodiles and presenting food offerings to god statues was intentional. The crocodile was not a symbol of the god or a representation of the god. The crocodile was the god, physically present, alive and real and dangerous, accepting worship while remaining fundamentally wild and untamed. This understanding of the sacred animal as actual god rather than symbol distinguishes Egyptian religion from many other systems. When Egyptians worshipped a temple crocodile, they were not treating it as a stand-in for an absent deity. They believed they were in the actual presence of divinity. The crocodile's physical reality was part of its sacredness, not separate from it. This made Egyptian animal worship profoundly different from religions that used animals purely as symbols or metaphors. The decline of Sobek worship came gradually as Christianity spread through Egypt in the early centuries of the Common Era. The new religion did not have room for crocodile gods. Temples were closed, temple crocodiles were released or killed, and the elaborate infrastructure of animal worship was dismantled. Eventually, the worship of Sobek became illegal, existing only in secret if at all. The crocodiles themselves persisted in the Nile, but they were no longer divine. They became just animals, dangerous pests to be avoided or killed, stripped of their sacred status. Today, Nile crocodiles are extinct through much of their former Egyptian range, though they persist in some southern regions. The relationship between humans and crocodiles has changed utterly. We understand crocodile biology and behavior through science rather than religion. We know they are reptiles, products of evolution, following instincts programmed by genetics. They are not gods, they are animals, and while we might respect their role as apex predators, we do not worship them. Yet something has been lost in this transition from sacred to secular. The ancient Egyptians, in worshipping Sobek, acknowledged the power and danger of the natural world in a way that modern people often do not. They knew they were not separate from nature, not above it or beyond it. They lived within it, at its mercy, and they responded to that reality with reverence rather than conquest. Sobek represented everything dangerous and powerful about the Nile, and by honoring him, Egyptians honored the river itself and all the life it contained, beautiful and terrible, nurturing and deadly, life-giving and life-taking, all at once. Chapter 5. Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess and fierce protection. Why would a culture choose a hippopotamus as the symbol of motherhood and protection? What did ancient Egyptians understand about hippos that made them perfect representatives of childbirth? The answer might surprise you, because hippopotamuses are among the most dangerous animals in Africa, responsible for more human deaths than lions or crocodiles in many regions. Yet ancient Egyptian women prayed to Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, to protect them through pregnancy and childbirth, and her image was everywhere in Egyptian homes. This apparent contradiction reveals something profound about how the Egyptians understood danger, protection, and the fierceness required to defend new life. The hippopotamus is a massive animal, with males weighing up to 4 tons and females only slightly smaller. Despite their bulk and seemingly sluggish appearance, hippos are remarkably fast and aggressive. They have enormous mouths filled with tusk-like teeth that can deliver devastating bites. Hippos are territorial, particularly females with young, and they will attack anything they perceive as a threat, including boats and humans. In ancient Egypt, hippos inhabited the Nile in large numbers, especially in marshy areas and in the delta. They were a legitimate danger that people had to navigate carefully. Male hippos were particularly associated with chaos and destruction in Egyptian thought. The god Set, who represented disorder, storms, and violence, was sometimes depicted with hippopotamus features, though he was more commonly shown as an unidentifiable creature with a curved snout. Hunting hippopotamuses was a royal activity, with pharaohs depicted on temple walls harpooning hippos as a demonstration of their power to impose order on chaos. These hunts were probably both practical, reducing the danger hippos posed to communities, and symbolic, representing the king's role as defender against chaotic forces. But female hippopotamuses played an entirely different role in Egyptian religion. They were protective, fierce defenders of their young, and it was this maternal aggression that made the hippo goddess Taweret such an important deity for childbirth. In ancient Egypt, childbirth was extremely dangerous for both mother and child. Modern medical care did not exist. Many women died in childbirth, and infant mortality rates were high. Pregnancy and birth were times of great anxiety, requiring all the magical and religious protection that could be summoned. Enter Taweret, whose name means the great female, or she who is great. Taweret was depicted as a pregnant female hippopotamus standing upright on hind legs, often with the paws of a lion, the back and tail of a crocodile, and a head that combined hippo and perhaps crocodile features, depending on the artistic period. This combination of fearsome animals created a being of maximum protective power. The hippo provided maternal fierceness, the lion contributed predatory strength, and the crocodile added the aggressive defense of the Nile's most feared predator. Together, these elements created a goddess designed specifically to protect women and children. Taweret's appearance was deliberately grotesque and frightening. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her large belly indicated pregnancy. Her breasts hung pendulous, indicating motherhood and nursing. Her posture was aggressive, ready to attack any threat. This was not a gentle, serene goddess. This was a warrior goddess, a defender, a being that would tear apart anything that threatened her charges. For women facing the dangers of childbirth, this aggressive protection was exactly what they needed. Taweret was everywhere in Egyptian homes, particularly in areas where women lived and gave birth. Amulets, small carved figures of the goddess, were worn by pregnant women or kept near birthing areas. These amulets were made from various materials including faience, that beautiful glazed ceramic that Egyptians made in bright blues and greens, as well as stone, bone, and metal. Some amulets showed Taweret holding protective symbols, like the Sa sign, a hieroglyph representing protection. Others showed her holding knives, weapons ready to defend against demonic forces that might threaten mother or child. Beds and headrests, the furniture of sleep and rest, were often decorated with Taweret images. The reasoning was that sleep was a vulnerable time, a period when evil spirits might attack, and a pregnant woman was especially vulnerable. Taweret's image would guard the sleeping woman, her fierce presence deterring any malevolent forces. Some headrests show Taweret in her protective stance, sometimes surrounded by other protective deities like Bez, a dwarf god who also guarded women and children. Taweret appeared on wands used in magical rituals, particularly those designed to protect children. These wands, usually carved from hippopotamus ivory, were inscribed with protective spells and decorated with images of Taweret and other protective deities. A mother or midwife would wave the wand around a newborn baby or over a pregnant woman's belly, invoking the protective powers of the gods carved on it. The use of hippopotamus ivory for these protective wands created a direct physical connection to Taweret's power. Pottery vessels used in households often featured Taweret images, especially vessels associated with women's activities. Small bottles that may have held milk or other nursing-related liquids sometimes took the form of Taweret herself, so that the goddess literally contained and provided nourishment. These objects show how thoroughly Taweret was integrated into the daily life of Egyptian women, not as a distant temple deity, but as an immediate, tangible presence in the home. Interestingly, Taweret did not have major temple complexes dedicated solely to her. Unlike Sobek with his elaborate temple at Crocodilopolis, or Hathor with her magnificent shrine at Dendera, Taweret was primarily a household deity, a goddess of the people rather than of state religion. This does not mean she was less important. In some ways, household gods might have been more important to ordinary people than the great state gods, because household deities dealt with immediate, personal concerns like surviving childbirth rather than abstract concepts like cosmic order. Taweret could also be connected to the annual Nile flood, which makes sense given her hippopotamus nature. Hippos were closely associated with the Nile's marshy areas, and their presence increased during flood season when rising waters created more habitat for them. The flood itself was the source of Egypt's fertility, making the land pregnant with potential for new crops. Taweret, as a goddess of fertility and birth, naturally connected to this life-giving inundation. The flood gave birth to Egypt's agricultural abundance, just as mothers gave birth to children. In some myths, Taweret was associated with, or considered a counterpart to Bes, the dwarf god. Bes and Taweret often appeared together in protective contexts. Bes was also associated with childbirth, dancing, music, and joy. He was grotesque like Taweret, with a face designed to frighten evil spirits. Together, they formed a protective duo that guarded Egyptian homes and families. Some scholars believe Taweret might have originally been considered Bes's wife or female counterpart, though the relationship between deities in Egyptian religion was often fluid and changed over time. Taweret's protective role extended beyond birth to early childhood. Infant mortality in ancient times was extremely high, with many children dying before reaching their 5th birthday from various causes including disease, malnutrition, and accidents. Parents needed all the help they could get, both practical and spiritual, to keep their children alive. Taweret remained a guardian deity for young children, protecting them through the dangerous early years. Some ancient Egyptian children's graves have been found containing Taweret amulets placed with the child, either as protection in the afterlife or perhaps as evidence that the child had worn the amulet in life, but it had failed to save them. These archaeological finds are heartbreaking evidence of parents' desperate hopes and their faith that the goddess would protect their beloved children. When those children died despite the amulets, The parents ensured the protective goddess would accompany the child into the next world. Taweret's role in the afterlife expanded in some periods to include helping guide the deceased in the underworld. She could appear in the Book of the Dead, the collection of spells and images that helped the deceased navigate the afterlife's challenges. In this context, Taweret's protective nature helped the dead person reach their final destination safely, just as she protected living children reaching the destination of healthy adulthood. The fierce, frightening appearance that made Taweret an effective protector also made her a defeater of nightmares and evil dreams. Ancient Egyptians believed that sleep was dangerous, a time when the soul left the body and travelled, encountering spirits and forces that might harm it. Taweret could guard the sleeper, especially vulnerable pregnant women and children, driving away demons that caused nightmares or tried to steal souls during sleep. Some spells invoke Taweret specifically against nightmares and sleep terrors. The combination of multiple dangerous animals in Taweret's form was not random. Each component added specific powers to the whole. The hippo provided maternal protection and the connection to the Nile and water. The lion, the great land predator, added terrestrial hunting power and the fierce courage for which lions were famous. The crocodile contributed the Nile's most feared predator's aggression and the ability to move between water and land. Together, these formed a complete guardian, able to defend against any threat from any realm. This mixing of animal forms was common in Egyptian deities, but Taweret represented an especially potent combination. She was not subtle or refined. She was raw protective power given physical form. For women facing childbirth with all its dangers, subtle was not what they needed. They needed fierce. They needed unstoppable. They needed a goddess who would destroy anything that threatened them or their babies. Taweret delivered exactly that. Modern scholars sometimes struggle to understand Egyptian deities like Taweret because she does not fit neat categories. She is not really a fertility goddess in the sense of promoting conception. She is not really a mother goddess in the nurturing, gentle sense. She is protection personified, aggression in service of defending the vulnerable, fierceness channeled toward a loving purpose. She embodies the truth that sometimes love requires violence, that protecting the innocent demands being dangerous to their enemies. This is the lesson of the hippopotamus goddess. Real protection is not gentle. Real defense is not pretty. The same massive jaws that would crush a crocodile or gore a lion were also the jaws of a mother protecting her calf. The same fierce territoriality that made hippos dangerous to boats and people was also what kept hippo calves safe from predators. Ancient Egyptian women understood this. They did not want a gentle, sweet goddess for childbirth. They wanted Taweret, terrifying and grotesque, and utterly devoted to their survival and their children's survival. When Christianity came to Egypt, household deities like Taweret and Bes were among the last forms of old religion to disappear. Official temple worship could be banned and stopped relatively quickly. But what happened in people's homes, the amulets they wore, the prayers they whispered in the night, these continued for generations. Some historians believe Taweret's image influenced early Christian representations of the Virgin Mary, particularly in her protective aspects. The fierce mother protecting her child is a universal archetype that transcends particular religions. Today, hippopotamuses are extinct in Egypt, though they persist elsewhere in Africa. The marshes where they once lived have largely been drained. The Nile they inhabited has been tamed by dams. But Taweret lives on in museums, in the thousands of amulets and wands and vessels that survive from ancient Egypt. Modern people look at these objects and see art, history, archaeological artifacts. But to the Egyptian woman who wore a Taweret amulet while labouring to bring a new life into the world, it was not art, it was hope. It was prayer made physical. It was the belief that the fearsome hippopotamus goddess was present, guarding her, ready to attack any force, physical or spiritual, that threatened her or her child. The hippopotamus goddess teaches us that protection requires strength, that love can be fierce, that the guardian of innocence must be dangerous to evil. Taweret was never tame, never safe, never domesticated into sweetness. She remained wild, powerful, and terrifying, which is exactly why women trusted her with their lives and the lives of their children. In a dangerous world, they needed a dangerous goddess on their side, and Taweret delivered. Chapter 6. The Sacred Lotus and the Daily Miracle of Rebirth. Have you ever noticed how a flower's behavior can seem like magic? Imagine watching a flower close at night, sink beneath the water, and then rise again at dawn, opening its petals to greet the sun. If you did not understand the biology behind this behavior, what would you think? Would you see death and resurrection? Would you see proof that the sun has power over life itself? This is exactly what ancient Egyptians witnessed daily in the Nile's lotus flowers, and what they saw in those flowers shaped their deepest beliefs about death, rebirth, and the nature of the sun god who ruled the heavens. The lotus flower that dominated ancient Egyptian symbolism was actually two different species. The blue lotus, properly called the blue water lily, Nymphaea caerulea, had bright blue petals and a golden centre. The white lotus, Nymphaea lotus, had pure white petals that opened at night rather than during the day. Both species grew abundantly in the Nile's calm waters and marshes, creating vast floating gardens that perfumed the air with their sweet fragrance. Today, these flowers are less common in Egypt due to habitat loss, but they remain elsewhere in Africa and have been introduced to other warm climates around the world. The blue lotus was particularly important in Egyptian religious symbolism. This flower exhibits a remarkable daily cycle. In the evening, the flower closes its petals tightly and sinks below the water's surface, essentially disappearing for the night. At dawn, as the sun rises, the flower rises with it, breaking the surface and opening its petals to reveal its bright blue and gold colouring. This behaviour, repeated every single day with perfect reliability, seemed to the ancient Egyptians like a miracle, like proof of resurrection, like the flower dying each night and being reborn each morning. This daily resurrection connected the lotus immediately to Ra, the sun god. Ra performed the same journey every day, dying in the west as the sun set, travelling through the dangerous underworld during the night, and being reborn in the east at dawn. The lotus flower enacted this same pattern. It died at night and was reborn at dawn. The parallel was too perfect to ignore. The lotus became one of the primary symbols of the sun and of the resurrection that the sun represented. But the symbolism went deeper than mere daily cycles. Egyptian creation mythology featured the lotus prominently. According to one creation myth, in the beginning there was only none, the primordial waters of chaos. From these waters, a lotus flower emerged, and from this lotus flower came the sun god, either Ra or the young sun god Nefertum, depicted as a beautiful youth wearing a lotus flower on his head. In some versions, the lotus flower opened to reveal the newborn sun god sitting within, like a child in a cradle. The entire universe came from a lotus flower rising from primordial waters. This creation myth mirrors what Egyptians observed in nature. Lotus flowers do emerge from water, their roots anchored in mud at the bottom of ponds and marshes, their stems reaching up through the water, their flowers appearing at the surface. To ancient observers without modern biological knowledge, these flowers seem to be generating themselves from nothing but water and sunlight. The connection to creation was natural. If flowers could appear from water, why not the sun itself? Why not the world? The lotus became intimately associated with several deities beyond Ra. Nefertum, the god of perfume and fragrance, wore a lotus headdress and was said to be born from a lotus. Hathor, the goddess of love and joy, was sometimes depicted with a lotus flower, and festival celebrations in her honor involved lotus flowers extensively. Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, was connected to the lotus through its symbolism of rebirth. The deceased were often shown holding lotus flowers or smelling lotus bouquets, symbolizing their hoped for resurrection in the afterlife. In Egyptian art, the lotus flower appears everywhere. Tomb paintings show nobles seated on chairs decorated with lotus designs, holding lotus flowers to their noses to smell the perfume, wearing lotus flowers in their elaborate wigs. Temple columns were often carved to resemble bundles of lotus stems, with the capitals at the top shaped like lotus buds or open flowers. The temple itself became a stone garden of lotus, a forest of sacred flowers in architectural form. The lotus was also important in daily life. The flowers were used in numerous ways beyond symbolism. Their fragrance made them valuable for perfume making and for ritual purification. Lotus flowers and leaves were woven into garlands worn at festivals and celebrations. The seeds were edible, sometimes ground into flour. The stems could be eaten as vegetables. Young lotus shoots were considered delicacies, so the lotus provided both physical sustenance and spiritual meaning. Another example of Egyptian comfort, with multiple simultaneous purposes for the same organism. Egyptian art often shows people holding lotus flowers to their noses, apparently smelling them. This was not just appreciation of fragrance. The blue lotus contains psychoactive compounds that produce mild euphoria and relaxation when inhaled or consumed. Ancient Egyptians may have used blue lotus as a recreational intoxicant or as a sacrament in religious contexts to produce altered states of consciousness. Some scholars believe lotus was used in wine or beer, adding its psychoactive properties to alcohol's effects, creating a powerful combination used in festivals honoring the gods. The connection between lotus and altered consciousness links to the flower's symbolic meaning. The lotus bridged the realm of ordinary life and the realm of the gods. It grew from mud, the base matter of the earth, but produced beautiful flowers that reached toward the sun. It existed both beneath the water and above it. It sank into darkness and rose into light. These liminal qualities made the lotus a perfect substance for inducing the liminal mental states required to contact divine powers. In funerary contexts, the lotus symbolized the rebirth the deceased hoped to achieve. Just as the lotus rose from dark water into daylight, so the dead hoped to rise from the darkness of the tomb into the light of the afterlife. Tomb paintings often show 4 sons of Horus, important protective deities, emerging from lotus flowers, ready to assist the deceased. The deceased himself might be shown being reborn from a lotus, appearing within the flower like the sun god at creation. The lotus and the tilapia fish were often shown together, creating a double symbol of rebirth. The tilapia that appeared to give birth through its mouth and the lotus that appeared to die and be reborn daily were perfect complements. Together they formed a powerful statement about the possibility of resurrection. If these creatures and plants could overcome death, so could humans. This was not just hope. To the Egyptians, it was observable fact, demonstrated daily in the natural world. Lotus flowers also appeared in the context of offering. One of the most common offerings made to gods and to the deceased was a bouquet of lotus flowers. These might be real flowers in life, or painted representations in tombs and temples. The lotus offering carried multiple meanings. It provided pleasant fragrance for the gods or deceased's enjoyment. It symbolized rebirth and resurrection. It represented Upper Egypt, where lotus grew abundantly. It demonstrated wealth, as lotus bouquets were valuable, and it created a connection between the offerer and the divine powers, the flower serving as a bridge between human and God. The use of lotus in perfume and sacred oils was extensive. Egypt was famous throughout the ancient world for its perfumes, which were valued as luxury items and traded widely. Lotus formed one of the key ingredients in many of these perfumes. The process of making lotus perfume involved soaking the flowers in oils to extract their fragrance, a time-consuming process that required many flowers to produce small amounts of perfume. The resulting product was expensive and highly prized. One particularly interesting use of lotus was in the ritual called opening of the mouth. This ceremony was performed on mummies and on statues of gods and deceased people to activate them, to restore their ability to breathe, eat, speak, and receive offerings. During this ritual, various sacred objects touched the mouth of the mummy or statue, including an adze-shaped tool. But also included was a lotus flower. The flower's association with new life and rebirth made it an appropriate instrument for restoring animation to the deceased. The white lotus, which opened at night rather than day, was associated with the moon rather than the sun. It also appears in Egyptian art and symbolism, though less frequently than the blue lotus. The white lotus connected to lunar deities and to nighttime activities. Some texts describe the dead traveling through the underworld following the white lotus, using its nocturnal blooming as a guide through darkness. Children in ancient Egypt would have seen lotus flowers from their earliest days. These flowers were everywhere, growing wild in marshes, cultivated in wealthy people's garden pools, sold in markets, worn at festivals. A child would learn that lotus smelled good, that it appeared at sunrise, that it was sacred to the gods. Children probably played with lotus flowers, making garlands or miniature boats from the large floating leaves. The lotus was simultaneously sacred and familiar, special and common. The decline of lotus in Egypt came gradually over many centuries. As marshes were drained for agriculture, lotus habitat decreased. As the old religion gave way to new ones, the symbolic importance of the lotus diminished. Christianity and later Islam did not use lotus in their symbolism and ritual. The flower became just a flower, beautiful but no longer sacred. Today, true blue lotus is rare in Egypt, though it can still be found in some areas and is cultivated ornamentally. The lotus teaches us about the power of careful observation. The ancient Egyptians noticed the flower's behavior and found in it deep meaning. They did not need to understand the biological mechanisms causing the flower to open and close. They saw the pattern, recognized its significance, and incorporated it into their spiritual system. The lotus, rising daily from dark water into sunlight, was proof that resurrection was real, that life conquered death, that the sun would rise tomorrow just as it had yesterday and would continue rising forever. Modern people with our scientific understanding know that the lotus opens and closes due to temperature changes and light levels affecting the cells in the flower's petals. We know the flower does not actually die and resurrect. We know it is simply responding to environmental conditions through evolved mechanisms. But has this knowledge made the lotus more or less meaningful? We understand the mechanism, but have we lost the sense of wonder that the ancient Egyptians felt watching these flowers perform their daily transformation? Perhaps there is room for both understanding and wonder. Perhaps we can appreciate the lotus both as a biological organism following programmed responses and as a symbol of something deeper, a reminder that cycles exist, that darkness is followed by light, that what seems dead can return to life. The lotus still rises at dawn, even though no one worships it anymore. It still emerges from murky water to produce beautiful flowers. The pattern continues whether we see divine intervention or natural processes. And maybe that is the real lesson, that the universe operates according to patterns we can observe, and those patterns can fill us with awe, regardless of whether we attribute them to gods or to nature. The sacred lotus blooming on the Nile was a gift to ancient Egypt, a daily reminder that rebirth was possible, that beauty could emerge from mud, that light would follow darkness. That gift remains, even if we no longer read it the same way. Every lotus flower opening at dawn is still a small miracle, still a tiny resurrection, still a reason for hope. Chapter 7. The Hidden Life of Water Birds and Divine Messengers. What do you hear when you listen to a bird's call? Just noise, a pleasant sound? Or could it be a message from the divine? Ancient Egyptians listened very carefully to the birds that lived along the Nile's banks and marshes, and in their calls and behaviours they heard the voices of gods. Water birds were everywhere in ancient Egypt, filling the marshes with their cries, and each species carried particular meanings and associations. To understand Egypt, we must understand these birds, the messengers flying between earth and sky, between water and air, between human and divine. The Nile's marshes and shallows provided ideal habitat for countless bird species. Herons stood motionless in shallow water, waiting for fish to swim within striking range. Ibises probed the mud with their long, curved beaks, searching for small creatures. Ducks and geese congregated in noisy flocks, diving for water plants. Kingfishers perched on papyrus stems, watching for minnows. Pelicans floated placidly on deeper water, their huge bill pouches ready to scoop up fish. This avian abundance provided ancient Egyptians with food, entertainment, and spiritual inspiration. Of all the water birds, the ibis held the highest religious position. Specifically, the African sacred ibis, with its white body, black head and neck, and long curved beak, was the sacred animal of Thoth, one of Egypt's most important gods. Thoth was the god of wisdom, writing, mathematics, magic, and the moon. He was the divine scribe who recorded the deeds of gods and humans. He was the inventor of hieroglyphic writing. He was the arbitrator who settled disputes between gods, and he chose the ibis as one of his primary forms. Why did Thoth take the form of an ibis? Several features of this bird made it appropriate for a god of wisdom and writing. The ibis's long curved beak resembled the crescent moon, linking it to Thoth's role as a lunar deity. The ibis walked through marshes searching for food with what seemed like patient, systematic precision, as if it was studying or reading the mud for hidden information. And possibly most importantly, when the ibis left Egypt during summer's heat, migrating to other regions, it seemed to the Egyptians as if the bird was travelling to other realms, perhaps the realm of the gods, and then returning with divine knowledge. The ibis was sacred to such a degree that millions of ibises were mummified and offered to Thoth at his primary cult centres, especially at Hermopolis, the city most associated with Thoth worship. Archaeological excavations at sites associated with Thoth have uncovered enormous caches of mummified ibises, sometimes hundreds of thousands in a single location. These birds were raised specifically to be mummified and offered. The practice continued for over 1,000 years, from around the 7th century before the Common Era through the Roman period. The process of offering a mummified ibis to Thoth worked like this. A worshipper would pay priests to mummify an ibis on their behalf. The priests maintained facilities for raising, killing, and mummifying the birds. Once prepared, the mummified bird would be placed in a pot or wrapped in linen, and the worshipper would present it at the temple with prayers requesting Thoth's favour. The offering might seek wisdom, success in writing or scholarly pursuits, divine judgment in one's favour, or general blessing. The mummified ibis was a direct communication with the god, the sacred bird carrying the worshipper's message to the divine realm. The sheer scale of ibis mummification is staggering. Millions upon millions of birds were killed, mummified, and offered over the centuries. This had a significant impact on ibis populations. The demand for birds to mummify was constant and high. While some birds were raised in captivity, others were caught from wild populations. Eventually, the African sacred ibis was driven to extinction in Egypt, partly through habitat loss, but also partly through the enormous toll taken by religious practices. Today, this bird exists in other parts of Africa, but it has not lived wild in Egypt for over a century. Herons were also important water birds, though they never achieved the ibis's supreme religious status. The heron's patient hunting behavior, standing motionless for long periods before striking with lightning speed, gave it associations with contemplation and sudden decisive action. Some texts compare the heron to the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of Nun at creation, because the bird stood so still in water that it resembled a stationary object, and the white plumage of many heron species could look like a mound of light rising from dark water. The Bennu bird, sometimes identified as a heron species, perhaps the grey heron, held special significance in creation mythology. The Bennu was associated with the sun, with rebirth, and with the flooding of the Nile. It was said to be self-created, like the god Atum, bringing itself into existence by will alone. The Bennu would appear at the beginning of each new era, marking cosmic rebirth. Greek travellers who heard stories of the Bennu later associated it with their own phoenix legend, the mythical bird that died in fire and was reborn from its ashes. Ducks and geese, abundant in the Nile's marshes, provided practical benefit as a food source while also carrying symbolic meaning. These birds moved between water and sky with ease, making them symbols of transition and travel. The deceased were sometimes depicted as birds in tomb paintings, suggesting that the soul could take bird form to fly between the world of the living and the land of the dead. Duck and goose hunting scenes were common in tomb art, showing nobles in papyrus boats hunting birds with throw sticks, a kind of boomerang used to knock birds from the sky. These hunting scenes were not just decorations or records of pleasant pastimes. They had symbolic meaning related to order and chaos. The marshes, with their dense vegetation, their dark pools, their hidden dangers, represented chaos and the uncontrolled aspects of nature. The noblemen hunting there represented the imposition of order, the human and civilized controlling the wild and chaotic. Bringing down birds from the sky was bringing the celestial down to earth, making the uncontainable containable. These hunts reenacted the fundamental Egyptian concern with maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order, against the ever-present threat of chaos. The actual practice of hunting waterfowl was an important economic activity. Birds provided meat and eggs, feathers for decorative and practical uses, and recreation for the wealthy. Professional bird catchers used nets to trap large numbers of ducks and geese, which could be kept alive and fattened before slaughter or killed immediately. Domestication of geese and possibly ducks occurred early in Egyptian history, providing a reliable source of eggs and meat. Roasted goose was a special treat, and scenes of food preparation sometimes show workers plucking and preparing waterfowl. Eggs, especially waterfowl eggs, had their own symbolism. The egg represented potential, the undeveloped form that would become life. Some creation myths featured a cosmic egg from which the world emerged. The god Geb, the earth god, was sometimes called the Great Cackler, who laid the cosmic egg that contained the sun. This myth connected creation to the very real and familiar experience of finding bird eggs, watching them hatch, seeing new life emerge from what appeared to be an inert object. The kingfisher, a small, brilliantly coloured bird that hunts fish by diving from perches, was admired for its beauty and hunting skill. The bright blue and orange plumage of some kingfisher species made them visually striking. The bird's ability to plunge into water and emerge with a fish seemed almost magical. While kingfishers did not achieve major religious status, they appear in art and may have been kept as decorative pets by wealthy families, valued for their beauty and entertainment value as they hunted in garden pools. Pelicans, with their enormous beaks and bill pouches, were sometimes associated with self-sacrifice because of a behaviour where the birds would press their beaks against their breasts to disgorge food for their young, which could leave red stains from ruptured blood vessels, making it appear as if the bird was feeding its young with its own blood. This behaviour gave pelicans associations with parental devotion and sacrifice. Later, This same observation influenced Christian symbolism, where the pelican became a symbol of Christ's sacrifice. The lapwing, a bird with distinctive crest feathers and elaborate aerial displays, was used in hieroglyphic writing to represent the common people of Egypt. The Rekhite. Images showing conquered enemies often included the lapwing symbol, indicating subjugation of populations. The lapwing's habit of running along the ground rather than flying, despite having functional wings, may have suggested to Egyptians people who could not or did not rise to higher status, remaining grounded and earthbound. Storks migrated through Egypt in large numbers during seasonal movements, and their arrival coincided with the Nile's flooding. This connection between stork migration and the annual inundation gave storks associations with fertility and renewal. The regular return of storks each year also provided a kind of calendar, helping people predict when floods would begin and when agricultural seasons would change. Birds thus served as living clocks, marking time through their migrations and behaviors. Flamingos, with their spectacular pink coloring and habit of gathering in large flocks, were probably seen in Egypt during ancient times, though their exact range and abundance are uncertain. These birds would have been remarkable sights, their pink feathers standing out dramatically against blue water and green vegetation. Flamingos feed by filtering water through specialized beaks, a unique behavior that must have fascinated ancient observers. However, flamingos do not seem to have achieved significant religious status, perhaps because they were not reliably present, or perhaps simply because other birds already occupied all the symbolic niches. The ancient Egyptians practiced augury, interpreting the flight and behavior of birds to predict the future or understand divine will. A bird flying from a particular direction might be a good or bad omen, depending on the species and the circumstances. A bird calling at an unusual time could be a divine message. Dreams involving birds could be significant, requiring interpretation by priests skilled in dream analysis. Birds were messengers, their movements and calls forming a language that those trained to read it could understand. The practice of hunting birds with throw sticks required skill and practice. The wooden throw stick, shaped like a boomerang but not designed to return, was weighted to fly accurately and hit hard enough to stun or kill a bird in flight. A skilled hunter could bring down multiple birds on a single outing. This hunting method appears frequently in tomb art, showing the deceased demonstrating their skill, providing food for their family, and exercising control over the wild marshland environment. Birds were also kept as pets or for ritual purposes. Geese and ducks could be tamed and kept in gardens or courtyards. Wealthier households might keep exotic species as decorative animals. Some temples kept sacred flocks of particular species, caring for them as living representatives of deities. When these sacred birds died, they might be mummified and buried with ceremony, similar to temple cats, crocodiles, and ibises. The connection between birds and the soul or spirit was profound in Egyptian thought. The Ba, one component of the Egyptian soul, was depicted as a human-headed bird. This Ba could leave the body after death and travel, visiting places the person loved in life, or flying between the tomb and the underworld. The Ba's bird form made sense because birds moved freely between earth and sky, between different realms. The Ba needed that same freedom to fulfill its function in the afterlife. The diversity of water birds along the Nile provided ancient Egyptians with a constant display of nature's variety and abundance. Every walk along the river's bank would reveal different species in different behaviors: hunting, nesting, fighting, calling, flying. This variety made the Nile's environment rich and interesting, never boring, always offering something new to observe. For a culture that paid close attention to nature, these birds were endlessly fascinating, and that fascination translated into art, writing, and religious practice. The decline of bird populations along the Nile has paralleled the decline of the marshland habitat they required. As marshes were drained for agriculture and urban development, as the Nile's natural flooding was stopped by dams, as pollution increased and human population grew, many bird species declined or disappeared from Egyptian regions where they once thrived. The ibis, once so common that millions could be mummified, is extinct in Egypt. Other species persist, but in reduced numbers. The bird songs that once filled the air along the Nile have quieted, but the images remain, carved in stone, painted on tomb walls, written in hieroglyphs. We can still see the ibis serving Thoth, the heron standing on the primordial mound, the ducks and geese flying through marshes painted 3,000 years ago. These water birds connected ancient Egyptians to their gods, provided food for their bodies, inspired their art, and helped them understand the nature of the soul and its journey after death. They were messengers in every sense, carrying physical messages through their migrations, spiritual messages through their associations with gods, and artistic messages through the ages, showing us how deeply a culture can connect with the birds sharing their environment. Chapter 8. The circle completed and the waters flow eternal. We have travelled far together down the Nile, meeting fish and flowers, crocodiles and hippos, birds and the gods they represented. We have seen how the ancient Egyptians understood the aquatic life surrounding them not just as resources or dangers, but as teachers and symbols, as bridges between the human world and the divine. But what does all this mean? Why does it matter today, thousands of years after the last temple to Sobek closed, after the last sacred ibis was mummified, after the last priest interpreted the opening of a lotus flower as proof of resurrection? What can we learn from the ancient Egyptian understanding of the Nile's aquatic life? The most fundamental lesson is about observation and respect. The ancient Egyptians looked closely at the world around them. They noticed behaviours and patterns. They saw the tilapia protect its eggs in its mouth and release living young. They saw the lotus sink and rise with the sun. They saw crocodiles emerge from the river to sun themselves on banks. And they took these observations seriously. They asked what these behaviours meant, what they revealed about the nature of reality, how they connected to human concerns about life, death, and meaning. This careful attention to nature is something modern people have largely lost. We can go days without really looking at a plant or animal. We interact with nature primarily as consumers, extracting what we want without establishing the kind of relationship the Egyptians had with their environment. We know more facts about biology and ecology than ancient Egyptians ever did, but we often lack the sense of connection and reverence they felt. The Nile's creatures were not just specimens to them. They were neighbours. They were symbols. They were manifestations of divine power. The Egyptian approach was also fundamentally optimistic. Despite living with real dangers, crocodiles that killed people, floods that could destroy villages, famines that brought starvation, they saw the natural world as fundamentally good and meaningful. The Nile was a gift. The flood was a blessing. The creatures in the river were sacred. Even dangerous animals like crocodiles and hippos were not evil, just powerful, requiring respect and proper approach. This is a very different view from religious systems that see nature as fallen, corrupted, or something to be dominated and exploited. The multiplicity of meaning in Egyptian symbolism is another important lesson. A fish was food and it was symbol. A crocodile was danger and it was God. The lotus was perfume and it was proof of resurrection. Things could be multiple things at once without contradiction. Modern thinking often demands either-or categories. Something is either material or spiritual, either practical or symbolic, either ordinary or sacred. The Egyptians thought in terms of both and. The sacred and the mundane interpenetrated completely. This way of thinking allowed for a richness of experience that we have largely lost. Imagine what it would be like to see every animal, every plant, every natural phenomenon as potentially meaningful, as potentially carrying a message or revealing a truth. Your daily walk by the river would become a spiritual practice. Your meal would be communion with divine gifts. Your work, fishing or hunting or farming, would be participation in sacred patterns. Nothing would be merely functional. Everything would sparkle with possible significance. The aquatic life of the Nile also taught the Egyptians about cycles and renewal. The tilapia's mouth brooding, the lotus's daily resurrection, the ibis's seasonal migration, the Nile's annual flood, all demonstrated that endings were followed by beginnings, that death was followed by life, that what went down would rise again. This cyclical understanding of time differs from modern linear thinking that sees time as progressing in one direction toward a final endpoint. The Egyptian view was more hopeful in some ways. There was always another cycle, always another chance, always renewal coming. The prominence of female deities and female symbolism connected to aquatic life is worth noting. Hathor associated with the Tilapia, Neith connected to the Nile perch, Taweret the hippopotamus goddess. The Nile itself was life-giving, fertile, generative, qualities associated with femininity. This created a religion with strong feminine elements, honouring the power of birth, nurturing, and protection. While Egyptian society was patriarchal in its political structure, its religious life honoured female power extensively, perhaps because the fundamental fact of their existence, the Nile's yearly gift of fertility, seemed so clearly feminine. The integration of the practical and spiritual is another lesson. The Egyptians did not separate religion from daily life. They did not have a category for secular. Everything was potentially sacred, and sacred things also had practical uses. This integration meant that ordinary activities like fishing, farming, or cooking were understood as having spiritual dimensions. Work was worship, daily life was ritual. The boundary between sacred and secular that modern people take for granted did not really exist for ancient Egyptians. The environmental lesson is perhaps most urgent for today. The ancient Egyptians lived sustainably with the Nile for thousands of years. They took from the river, but did not destroy it. They hunted fish and birds, but did not drive them to extinction during most of their history. They understood that their survival depended on the river's health, so they honoured and protected it. Yes, the intensive mummification of ibises eventually contributed to their extinction, showing the Egyptians were not perfect environmental stewards, but overall, their relationship with the Nile was sustainable in ways our modern relationship with nature is not. The decline and loss of the Nile's traditional relationship with Egyptian people shows us what happens when that sustainable relationship breaks. The Aswan High Dam, completed in the 1960s, stopped the annual flood. This created benefits, including year-round irrigation and hydroelectric power. But it also stopped the deposition of fertile silt, requiring artificial fertilizers. It trapped sediment behind the dam, causing the Nile Delta to erode into the Mediterranean. It changed fish populations, as species adapted to the natural flood cycle struggled with permanent reservoir conditions. The sacred Nile, in many ways, no longer exists. It has been transformed into a managed water system. This transformation provided material benefits, but spiritual losses. The modern Egyptian does not experience the miracle of the annual flood. The ancient connection to the river's rhythms has been severed. The sense that the Nile is a divine gift requiring reverence has been replaced by the view that it is a resource to be exploited and managed. We gained control and predictability but lost enchantment and wonder. Was the trade worth it? That is for Egyptians to judge, but the loss is real. The creatures we have met on this journey, the tilapia and catfish, the crocodile and hippopotamus, the lotus and ibis, were not just animals and plants to the ancient Egyptians. They were vocabularies for expressing complex ideas about existence. They were the raw materials from which the Egyptians constructed a system of meaning that sustained their civilization for 3,000 years. They were proof that the gods were present and active, that the universe was ordered according to benevolent principles, that human life had purpose, and that death was not the end. Modern science explains these creatures in different terms. We understand tilapia mouth, brooding through evolutionary biology and behavioral ecology. We understand lotus flower movements through plant physiology and phototropism. We understand crocodile behavior through reptilian neurology and instinct. Our explanations are accurate and useful, but they do not carry the weight of meaning that the ancient explanations did. Our accurate knowledge is spiritually thin compared to the rich symbolic web the Egyptians wove from their observations. Perhaps we need both. Perhaps we can understand the biological mechanisms while also appreciating the wonder and meaning. Perhaps a lotus flower opening at dawn can be both a response to temperature and light levels, and also a daily reminder that darkness is followed by light, that life persists, that beauty emerges from muddy water. Perhaps a tilapia protecting eggs in its mouth can be both a reproductive strategy favoured by natural selection and also a symbol of devoted protection and the miracle of new life. Science and symbol need not be enemies. They can complement each other, giving us both accurate understanding and deep meaning. The ancient Egyptians did not have our knowledge, but they had wisdom we have lost. They understood that humans are not separate from nature, but part of it. They knew that treating the natural world with respect and reverence was not just ethically good, but existentially necessary. They recognized that the patterns we observe in nature reflect deeper patterns in the structure of reality itself, and they knew that watching a fish swim, a flower bloom, or a bird fly could teach lessons more important than any written in books. As we complete our journey down the ancient Nile, floating in our imagined papyrus boat past marshes and temples, past fishermen casting nets and priests presenting offerings, past crocodiles sunning themselves and lotus flowers opening to the dawn, we can reflect on what the ancient Egyptians have taught us. They showed us that the everyday can be sacred, that the familiar can be miraculous, that careful attention to nature reveals profound truths. They demonstrated that religion can be joyful, sensual, and life-affirming, rather than ascetic and world-denying. They proved that humans can live in deep connection with their environment for millennia when they approach it with respect and wisdom. The Nile still flows. It still carries water from the African highlands to the Mediterranean Sea. It still sustains Egypt, as it has for thousands of years. But the relationship has changed. The gods are gone from the temples. The sacred crocodiles no longer wear golden bracelets. No one mummifies ibises by the millions. The lotus blooms, but no one sees in it proof of resurrection. The old Egypt has ended, replaced by new cultures, new religions, new relationships with the ancient river, yet something persists. The Nile is still central to Egyptian identity. Egyptians still call their country Missa, a name connected to the root meaning land or country. But the Nile remains the defining feature of that land. The river is still loved, still honoured, still recognised as the source of Egyptian life. The forms of that recognition have changed, but the fundamental truth remains. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. It always was, and it always will be. And so we come to the end of our journey, but of course it is not really an end. The Nile flows on. The cycles continue. The sun rises tomorrow as it rose yesterday, as it has risen every day for billions of years and will continue to rise for billions more. The patterns persist, even when we no longer read them the same way. And somewhere in Africa, perhaps not in Egypt but in regions still wild, the descendants of the ancient fish still swim, the descendants of the sacred birds still fly, and lotus flowers still open at dawn, performing their daily miracle for anyone who takes the time to notice and to wonder. The ancient Egyptians would want us to notice. They would want us to wonder. They would want us to see in the natural world not just resources to extract or problems to solve, but teachers, companions, and manifestations of the sacred. They would want us to approach life's waters calming depths and dangerous currents alike, with respect, reverence, and attention. They would want us to understand that we are swimming in mystery, surrounded by meaning, sustained by forces we should honor, even if we cannot fully understand them. This is their gift to us across the millennia. Not just the artifacts and art we display in museums, not just the pyramids and temples tourists visit, but this wisdom, that life is sacred, that nature is divine, that paying attention matters, that meaning is everywhere for those with eyes to see it. The Nile's aquatic life taught this to the ancient Egyptians, and through them they teach it to us still. The waters flow eternal, the symbols endure, and somewhere deep in the calming depths of ancient symbolism, truths wait to be discovered by anyone willing to push their papyrus boat into the current and float downstream. Eyes open, heart receptive, ready to be amazed by a fish, instructed by a flower, and reminded that this world, our world, is far more wonderful than we usually remember. Thank you for traveling this journey with me. May the Nile's eternal gift flow through your life as it has flowed through Egypt, bringing fertility to your mind, renewal to your spirit, and wonder to your days. Chapter 9. The European Eel and Mysteries of the Deep. Where do eels come from? For thousands of years, this question puzzled anyone who paid attention. Eels appeared in rivers and lakes, but no one ever saw eel eggs or tiny baby eels being born. Where did they originate? This mystery made eels perfect candidates for religious and symbolic significance in ancient Egypt, where mystery was always seen as a doorway to the divine. The European eel that swam in the Nile was associated with powerful gods, including Ra and Atum, and understanding why reveals fascinating truths about how ancient people approached the unknown. The European eel is a strange creature by any standard. It has an elongated snake-like body, smooth skin, tiny fins, and the ability to breathe through its skin, which allows it to survive for extended periods out of water. Eels can move overland on wet nights, slithering through grass to reach new water bodies. This ability to exist both in water and out of it, to travel between separated pools, gave eels an otherworldly quality. How could a fish walk on land? What kind of creature had such powers? More mysterious still was the eel's reproductive cycle, which would not be fully understood until modern times. Eels that live in rivers and lakes are not reproducing there. They are juveniles and adults, living out most of their lives far from their birthplace. When the time comes to reproduce, mature eels undergo a transformation. Their eyes enlarge, their colouring changes, and they begin a journey that can span thousands of miles. European eels migrate from rivers and lakes all the way to the Sargasso Sea in the Atlantic Ocean, where they spawn and die. The larvae then drift on ocean currents back toward Europe and North Africa, eventually entering rivers as tiny transparent glass eels, which then mature and grow. This entire process takes years and covers vast distances. Ancient Egyptians, of course, knew nothing of the Sargasso Sea or ocean currents or the eel's complex life cycle. What they knew was that eels appeared in the Nile with no obvious origin. No one found eel eggs. No one saw parent eels caring for young. Eels simply existed, as if generated spontaneously from the Nile's mud or created by magical processes. This apparent spontaneous generation made eels perfect symbols for self-created deities and for the mysterious origins of life itself. The god Atum, who created himself from the primordial waters and then began the creation of everything else, was associated with eels. This connection makes perfect sense symbolically. Just as Atum emerged from nothing, created by his own will, so eels seem to emerge from nothing, appearing without parents or eggs. The eel embodied the principle of self-generation, of life creating itself from apparently lifeless matter. This was one of the central mysteries of existence that Egyptian religion attempted to explain, and the eel provided a natural example that seemed to prove it was possible. Ra, the sun god, was also connected to eels in some texts. The eel's ability to move through water, mud, and even across land mirrored Ra's ability to move through different realms. The sky during the day, the underworld during the night, and the horizon at dawn and dusk. The eel was a traveller between worlds, never entirely belonging to any single element. It was fish, but also something more than fish, water creature, but also capable of terrestrial existence. This liminal nature suited Ra, who himself moved between different states and realms. Interestingly, eels were among the fish associated with the solar barque, Ra's boat that travelled across the sky during the day and through the underworld at night. According to some texts, eels swam ahead of the boat, serving as scouts or guides, warning Ra of dangers and helping navigate treacherous waters. The image of eels guiding the sun god's boat through the dark waters of the underworld is poetic and profound. These mysterious creatures, comfortable in darkness, able to sense their way through murky environments, were ideal guides through the realm of death. In practical terms, eels were caught and eaten in ancient Egypt. They were a good food source, with fatty, rich meat that could be preserved by smoking or salting. Eel fishing required different techniques than catching other fish. Eels hide in mud and crevices during the day and are most active at night. Traps placed in strategic locations could catch eels, or fishermen could probe in muddy bottoms with spears, feeling for the distinctive muscular bodies. The difficulty of catching eels may have added to their mystique. Creatures that hid so effectively, that lived in the mud and darkness, that emerged primarily at night, naturally seemed mysterious and potentially magical. The eel's snake-like appearance created both fascination and some concern. Snakes in Egyptian symbolism were complex, representing both protective and dangerous forces. The uraeus, the rearing cobra worn on royal crowns, protected the pharaoh by spitting fire at enemies. But the chaos serpent Apophis was the ultimate enemy, threatening to destroy Ra and prevent the sun from rising. Eels, looking like water snakes, partook of this dual nature. They could be protective guides or dangerous unknowns, depending on context and interpretation. Some scholars believe that eels may have played a role in certain mystery cults and initiation ceremonies. The eel's transformation during its reproductive migration, when it changes colour and develops larger eyes, preparing for its final journey, could have served as a metaphor for the transformation the initiate hoped to achieve. Moving from one state to another, from juvenile to mature, from river-dwelling to ocean-going, from life to death to rebirth in new form, the eel's life cycle contained all the elements of transformative mystery religion. The eel also appears in medical and magical texts from ancient Egypt. Eel fat was used in various medicines and ointments, valued for its supposed healing properties. Magical spells sometimes invoked eels or used eel parts as ingredients in protective charms. The reasoning seems to have been that the eel's mysterious origins and transformative abilities could be harnessed for healing and protection. If the eel could transform and travel between realms, perhaps its essence could help humans undergo necessary transformations of healing or spiritual development. Modern people knowing the eel's actual life cycle might think it is less mysterious, but actually understanding the truth makes the eel even more remarkable. A creature that begins life as a transparent larva drifting in ocean currents, transforms into a glass eel entering rivers, grows into a yellow eel living in fresh water for years or even decades, then transforms again into a silver eel that migrates thousands of miles to spawn in a specific part of the ocean before dying. This life cycle is genuinely amazing. The ancient Egyptians sensing mystery in eels were absolutely correct. They just did not know the specific details of that mystery. The eel teaches us that acknowledging mystery is not primitive or ignorant. Mystery is real. We live surrounded by processes we do not fully understand, by complexity that exceeds our current knowledge, by phenomena that provoke genuine wonder. The ancient Egyptians, confronted with eels whose origin they could not explain, responded by incorporating them into their religious system, making them sacred to gods of creation and transformation. This was a reasonable and sophisticated response to genuine mystery. Today, we can explain where eels come from, but the explanation in no way diminishes the wonder of their existence. The full understanding of eel migration and reproduction only came in the 20th century. For thousands of years, the eel's life cycle was genuinely mysterious, and even now, with our scientific understanding, elements remain uncertain. How exactly do eels navigate across thousands of miles of ocean to reach the Sargasso Sea? What environmental cues trigger their transformation and migration? These questions are still being researched. The eel reminds us to maintain humility in the face of nature's complexity. Every answer we find reveals new questions. Every mystery we solve shows us new mysteries waiting to be explored. The ancient Egyptians were right to see divine presence in phenomena they could not explain. They were right to honor mystery rather than pretend it did not exist. They were right to create stories and symbols that expressed their sense of awe before the natural world's wonders. So, as we add the eel to our understanding of the Nile's aquatic life, let us see it as the ancient Egyptians did, as a traveler between worlds, a self-created being, a guide through darkness, a living mystery that provokes questions about origins and transformations. Let us see it also as modern science reveals it, as a creature with one of nature's most extraordinary life cycles, a fish that must die in the place of its birth, that gives its life to create the next generation. Both visions, ancient and modern, acknowledge that the eel is special, remarkable, worthy of our attention and respect. The eel swimming in the Nile was food and symbol, creature and mystery, another gift from the river that sustained Egyptian bodies and souls alike. Chapter 10. The Nile Perch and the Warrior Goddess. Can a fish be terrifying? When that fish can grow to over 6 feet long and weigh over 400 pounds, when it has a mouth large enough to swallow sizable prey whole, when it is an aggressive apex predator that dominates its aquatic environment, then yes, that fish can definitely inspire terror. The Nile perch was such a creature, and its association with Neith, the ancient warrior goddess, made perfect symbolic sense. Here was a fish that embodied power, aggression, and dominance, qualities that perfectly matched a goddess of war and hunting. The Nile perch is a massive fish, one of the largest freshwater fish in the world. It has a big head, a wide mouth filled with numerous small teeth, and powerful body built for bursts of speed when attacking prey. Nile perch are opportunistic predators, eating other fish, crustaceans, and even small animals that fall into the water. They are aggressive and territorial, defending their feeding areas against competitors. A large Nile perch is the undisputed ruler of its section of river, and everything else either stays clear or becomes food. This aggressive, dominant nature made the Nile perch an appropriate sacred animal for Neith, one of the oldest and most important goddesses in Egyptian religion. Neith was a warrior goddess, often depicted with a bow and arrows, and also a creator goddess associated with weaving and the primordial waters. Her cult center was at Sais in the Nile Delta, where a major temple complex honored her. At Esna, further south, Neith was specifically associated with the Nile perch, and perch mummies have been found at sites connected to her worship. The connection between Neith and the Nile perch went beyond mere size and aggression. Neith was one of the oldest deities in Egyptian religion, present from the very earliest times, and she retained her importance throughout Egyptian history. She was never completely absorbed into other deities or pushed aside by newer gods. Like the Nile perch dominating its environment, Neith dominated the divine realm, commanding respect from gods and humans alike. She was said to be the mother of Ra himself in some traditions, making her the mother of the sun, the mother of light and life. Neith's association with weaving connected to the idea of creating and ordering the cosmos. She wove the world into existence, bringing order from chaos, creating pattern from randomness. The Nile perch, as apex predator, also creates order in its ecosystem, controlling prey populations, maintaining balance through its feeding. Both goddess and fish were forces of organization and control, imposing structure on their respective realms. The Nile perch's hunting behavior was well known to ancient Egyptians. These fish often hunt in murky water or at depths where visibility is poor, relying on their ability to sense vibrations and detect prey, even in darkness. This skill paralleled Neith's association with wisdom and knowledge, her ability to see what was hidden, to understand what others missed. The perch could find prey in conditions where other predators failed. Neith could perceive truth in situations where others saw only confusion. Fishing for Nile perch was challenging and potentially dangerous. A large perch could damage boats, break fishing equipment, and even injure fishermen. Landing such a fish required skill, strength, and courage. Success in catching a Nile perch demonstrated the same qualities that warriors needed in battle: bravery, skill, and the ability to overcome a powerful opponent. This parallel between fish hunting and warfare reinforced the connection between Neith and her sacred fish. Tomb paintings sometimes show nobles hunting large fish, and while species are not always identifiable in the artistic representations, some of these large fish are likely Nile perch. The act of spearing a massive perch from a papyrus boat would have been exciting and dangerous, requiring considerable athletic ability and nerve. It was a way for the elite to demonstrate their prowess in a context that combined sport with symbolic significance. Conquering the great fish was like conquering chaos, imposing human will on the wild power of the river. The Nile perch appears in religious texts as well as in art. Offerings to Neith at her temples could include Nile perch, either actual fish or representations of them. Bronze figures of Nile perch have been found at temple sites, perhaps serving as votive offerings or as cult objects in rituals. These bronze fish, carefully crafted to show the perch's distinctive features, demonstrate the importance of this species in religious practice. Interestingly, the introduction of Nile perch to Lake Victoria in East Africa in the modern era has been an ecological disaster, showing just how devastating an apex predator can be when introduced to a new environment. The Nile perch has driven numerous native fish species to extinction in Lake Victoria, fundamentally altering the lake's ecosystem. This modern example validates the ancient perception of the Nile perch as a powerful, dominant, and potentially destructive force. The ancient Egyptians were right to see in this fish a creature of terrifying power that demanded respect. The warrior goddess and her fish shared attributes of strength, aggression, independence, and the ability to dominate their environments. Neith needed no male consort in many traditions. She was self-sufficient, creating and protecting on her own. The Nile perch also is solitary and independent, not schooling with others, not relying on cooperative hunting strategies. Both goddess and fish were loners in the best sense, powerful enough not to need help, confident enough to face challenges alone. Neith's role as a protective deity, especially of the king and of Lower Egypt, also connects to the perch's behavior. Female Nile perch, like many fish species, guard their eggs and newly hatched fry, protecting them aggressively against predators. This maternal protective behavior, combined with hunting prowess, created a creature that was both nurturing and deadly, capable of extreme violence in defense of its young but gentle with those it protected. Neith embodied this same combination, a warrior who could destroy Egypt's enemies, but also a protector who defended Egypt and its people. The worship of Neith at Sais was important enough that several pharaohs of the 26th dynasty, which ruled from Sais, incorporated the goddess prominently into their royal cult. Neith was invoked for military victories, for protection of the state, and for wisdom in governance. The Nile perch, as her sacred animal, shared in this honour. To harm the perch in areas where it was sacred would have been not just killing a fish, but insulting the goddess, risking her anger and the loss of her protection. The decline of Nile perch populations in Egypt has multiple causes, including overfishing, habitat degradation, and changes to the Nile's ecosystem caused by dam construction. While Nile perch still exist in some regions, they are far less abundant than in ancient times. The great fish that once symbolized divine power and inspired religious devotion are now primarily valued as food and sport fishing targets. The sacred has become merely practical, another loss that accompanies modernization. But the memory of the Nile perch's sacred status reminds us that humans once saw even predators as worthy of religious devotion, as manifestations of divine qualities. The perch was not loved in the sense of being cuddly or friendly. It was respected, feared, and honored for its power. This relationship with powerful, dangerous creatures shows sophisticated understanding. Not everything worthy of respect is safe or comfortable. Some powers must be honored precisely because they are dangerous, because they force us to acknowledge forces greater than ourselves. The Nile perch and the warrior goddess teach us that strength deserves respect, that power can be divine, that aggression in the right context is not evil but necessary. Neith fought to protect creation and maintain order. The Nile perch fought to survive and feed. Both were engaged in necessary violence, the violence that protects, that maintains boundaries, that keeps chaos at bay. Ancient Egyptians understood this and honoured it, creating religious structures that acknowledged the full reality of existence, including its violent and dangerous aspects. The great fish swimming in the river was dinner, and it was God, protein and power, food and fear, all at once. And the Egyptians managed to see it clearly for what it was, magnificent, dangerous, and absolutely essential to the balance of life in the Nile.